and welcome to the all-new Legacy of Goku podcast. I am your host, Kevin Emery. I already have another podcast on the Jak and Daxter series, but this is another series. The Legacy of Goku series is another series that I'm really nostalgic about. I grew up playing these games like obsessively, almost even more than Jak and Daxter series. Even though I like the Jak and Daxter series more, but in a way, like I said, I've actually played these games even more than the Jak and Daxter series because I played them to freaking death. It's crazy, but I was gonna start with giving you a little trivia question, and then so this is how the podcast is gonna work. I usually always give a little trivia question. I do the same thing on my Jak and Daxter podcast, where I'll ask you a question, something related to the series, and then I tell you the answer at the end of the podcast, so it kind of gives you the entire podcast while I'm talking to kind of think about what you think the answer might be. So in today's episode, the trivia question will be, who was the artist that played Eyes of a Lion? And I'll tell you which game it was from. It was from the Legacy of Goku 2. There's a song that plays a couple of times in the game, actually plays 3 times to be specific. It plays once at the parade, at the Hercule parade, and then it plays again at Vinny's house when you're trying to destroy the generators to fight off Android, to stop Android 17 and 18 to becoming awakened. And then it happens once more if in the alternative ending of the game at the credits they play the song as well. It's So what was the name of the song? It has a name in the game. They say it several times in the game. And also, who was the artist, the fake artist, that played the song? So you think about it, like I said, as the podcast goes, and try to answer the question without cheating. Try to see if you can figure it out without Googling it, and then try to see if you can figure it out first. Like I said, I'll give you the answer at the end of the podcast. Anyway, I wanted to start the podcast by talking about kind of how I got into the series before I've started actually talking about the actual series itself. So I got into the Legacy of Goku. I played the very first game. My sister, my older sister, she got a Game Boy Advance for Christmas, and she also got a game with it, and that game was Legacy of Goku, the first one. And I played it when she got done playing. For a little while, I started playing, and I really, really liked it. It was something so cool about just getting to walk around and play as the character of Goku. Goku was like probably my 3rd or 4th favorite character at the time on Dragon Ball Z. My favorite character at the time was Trunks, because it was still during the time of the Cell Saga, Android Saga / Cell Saga that was airing on TV. And Trunks was like my favorite character. But Goku was definitely up there as one of my favorites. He was a really great character, I thought, too. And so it was cool to get to actually play as Goku and get to walk around. Because in the first game, you only get to play as Goku. It's called, the Legacy of Goku. And like I said, I had so much fun getting to play the game, and it was so cool to just walk around. And I never played an RPG. It's like an RPG, but it's also like an adventure game as well. You can tell it takes a lot of inspiration from like The Legend of Zelda, the first few of them, and probably how it got its title, The Legacy of Goku, and kind of a play, sort of the same style titling there, and. But yeah, I never played a game quite like that one before, because most of the games at that point mostly had played like platforming games, mostly like side-scrolling platforming games, but also 3D platformers and stuff like that as well. So this was the first like actual like open world style RPG game that I had ever really played before. And I thought it was a lot of fun to get to walk around, like I said, and level up your character. That was probably one of my favorite aspects of the game, was leveling up your character. And I had never played an RPG before. So I had a lot of fun, like I said, getting to level up Goku and stuff. But yeah, so that's pretty much how I got into the series, like I said, and I'll briefly go over, since it's probably going to be a little while before we get to Legacy of Goku 2. It's probably going to take a couple of podcasts before I get to that one. I'll go ahead and talk about how I kind of got into that game as well. So the Legacy of Goku, I just basically just my sister, like I said, just got that game for Christmas, and that's just how I wound up discovering it and playing it that way. And then finally, I heard about Legacy of Goku 2 coming out because I saw a commercial for it on TV. And so for my birthday, I think the year after that, I asked my mom if I could have it for my birthday. And so she did. She bought it for me for my birthday, and then I played it on my sister's Game Boy Advance. Eventually, I got my own Game Boy Advance, but at the time, it was still the only way I could play it was on my sister's. And I played the Legacy of Goku 2, and man, that game is just like miles better. Like I said, I'll get into more detail about this in a later podcast, but that game is just like, it's crazy how much better that game is than the first one. Now, I am actually one of those people that I still like the first one. Even after playing the second and third game, I still think the first game is a lot of fun to play. I still really like it. I do think it's the worst in the series when you compare all three of them together because it's a full trilogy. But that doesn't mean that I hate the game or I think the game is like outright bad. It's just not as good as, its sequels are. And but like I said, I know a lot of people have always, talked bad about this game, or they said, "Oh, I only liked it when I was a little kid, and then when I got older and played Legacy of Goku 2 or whatever, I realized how bad that game was." I can totally understand that because there are a lot of limitations to the first one, and it is the controls are a little clunky, and so I can totally understand where people are coming from, but I totally disagree, though. I think the first one is still a really fun game to play. I can still play the first one even to this day. Sometimes I'll play through the entire trilogy from time to time, and I still have a lot of fun playing the first one. It's a lot of fun getting to level up my character, but I will admit it's not as good, like I said, as Legacy of Goku 2 or Boo's Fury. Those games are much better. But then so I played Legacy of Goku 2, like I said, and then by this point I had my own Game Boy Advance SP, the SP model, where it had the backlight screen and everything, and the clamshell design. So I had I had played Legacy of Goku 2, like I said, at this point, to death. I mean, I'd played that game so many times, it's not even funny. I think even to this day, Legacy of Goku 2 is probably my most played game, like the game I played through the most times, and possibly even the game I put the most hours into, even in spite of the fact that it's not like the longest game in the world. I mean, it is for Game Boy Advance after all, they can't make it too big of a game because only so much stuff can fit on that cartridge. But it's a pretty good sized game, though, in all honesty, though, for a Game Boy Advance game. But obviously they can only go so far with it, and so I had played the game through many, many times. Like I said, it's probably my most played through game, even to this day, because that's how many times I've played through that game. I could practically play that game blindfolded. I played it so many times. And but I had no idea there was a third game that came out because of the fact that it came out as a different title. It came out a year later after Legacy of Goku 2. It came out as Boo's Fury, and I had never heard of the game. And I didn't know that there was even a third game that had come out. And I remember playing Legacy. Like I said, I won't get too much into this because, like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a later podcast. But since it is going to be a little while before we get to that, I'll talk a little bit about it. But I remember when I played Legacy of Goku 2, I often would think up ideas. It's probably the very first game I ever did this with. But I would actually think up ideas on things that I would improve in a third game. Like, in the third game, they're probably going to do like the Boo Saga, And I was like, this is something I would do, blah, 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 blah. The funny thing is some of those aspects that I wish that would be in the third game, actually winded up being in the third game. So it's like, it's kind of funny that I actually thought those up and it actually winded up being in the game. But yeah, I just found that kind of interesting. But yeah, anyway, years later when I was about, I was probably about 16, 17 years old. It had been several years later before I finally discovered this game, Boo's Fury. What had happened is I started, by that point, our family had finally gotten a computer and gotten internet, because for years we never had a computer or internet. And so I finally started learning how to use it a little bit. And so I started looking up. I was like, I wonder if they're going to ever make a Legacy of Goku 3, you know? So that's what I looked up. I was just like, will there ever be a Legacy of Goku 3? I think is what I typed in on Google or whatever. And then that's when I came across, that's when I think it was a forum on someone's website. I can't remember what, it was some kind of gaming website. And someone had put in the forums, it's like, will there ever be a Legacy of Goku 3 or whatever the question was they asked? And someone replied and said, well, there is. It's called Boo's Fury. It's the sequel to Legacy of Goku 2. And I was like, wait, there actually is a sequel to Legacy of Goku 2? And so that's when I looked it up. I was like, what is it called? Boo's Fury? And so I looked it up and I found the game and I looked up like some images and a little video. And because back then, at this point in time, it was still kind of hard to find videos of games, especially games that aren't like really well known. So I kind of looked up images on Google and stuff, and I looked at it and I was like, yeah, it does look like it's a Legacy of Goku game. I was like, I've got to see, if I can buy this game and see if I can still get it. So I found it on ebayhalf.com. Yeah, that's not a thing anymore, but back then that was a really popular website to buy video games on. But I went to ebayhalf.com and I found it for pretty cheap and bought the game. And as soon as it came in, I started playing. I was like, oh, yeah, so awesome. It was so good to get to play a fresh new game, sequel to Legacy of Goku 2. Like I said, I had so much fun playing it. I will admit I don't like Boo's Fury as much as Legacy of Goku 2, but it's still a really awesome game, and I have a lot of fun playing it. But anyway, that's pretty much how I discovered the series. So now I want to start kind of getting into the actual games and themselves and talk about like the individual areas, levels, mechanics, and a little bit of the lore. I won't get too much into the lore, especially with this video game series, because it's essentially just the story is essentially just a copy of the TV show, because they tried their best to stay as true as possible to the TV show as they could, because let's face it, when it comes to an aspect like this, when you're basing it off of a really popular show like Dragon Ball Z, people don't want originality. They want it to be accurate to what the original, and they do a pretty dang good job, especially with Legacy of Goku 2 and Boo's Fury. With the first one, you can tell they had to, they didn't put as much in the story, and they changed a few things for the aspect of the video game, and we'll get into some of that stuff later too. But with Legacy of Goku 2, like I said, they stayed very true to the story. So, but there are a few changes and add-ons, if you will, added stories to the games, which, believe it or not, are actually some of my favorite parts of the games. And we'll get a little bit into the lore of those parts. But like I said, with the exception of those parts, there's not really too much lore to talk about, because it's, like I said, it's based off the TV show. But I will talk a lot about the mechanics and the levels and the areas that you meet. So in Legacy of Goku, the very first Legacy of Goku game, the very first area you ever explore is on Master Roshi's Island. Now, the first thing you'll notice when you play this game, especially if you've never played it before, or you've only played the sequels and then you decide to play the first one later, is Goku controls very robotic, and his controls are very blocky, very stiff. He can only walk in 4 directions. It's just like, very blocky, very robotic controls. And so the controls aren't the best. Now, they didn't bother me when I first played the game, because I had never played a game quite like that one before, so the controls felt fine to me at that time. But I will admit, after I played Legacy of Goku 2 and also Boo's Fury, how much more smooth the controls are in that game, because you can walk in 8 directions, and you can also do the double tap system on your D-pad, do the double tap, and you can actually run, which is nice, which you cannot do in the first one. And so Goku is very slow also, which can feel a little draggy at the beginning of the game. The good thing is throughout the game your speed does increase as you get stronger, so that helps a little bit as you go on in the game. But like I said, at the beginning of the game your controls are very slow, very blocky. But so anyway, you start out on Master Roshi's Island. Your first mission is to collect 3 of Master Roshi's magazines. and return them all back to Master Roshi. So when I first played this game, I will admit that I had no idea what I was doing. Like I said, I'd never played an adventure game or an RPG before, so I didn't know what I was doing. I was walking around his island just kind of looking at stuff, and I will admit, though, I was having a lot of fun just getting to walk around his island, and I was just like, that was so cool to have such, to get to explore this area that I was familiar with from the TV show. But I honestly didn't know what the heck I was doing. It took me, I finally started just talking to everybody on the island, and then when I started talking to Master Roshi, he said something about his magazines, and I was like, oh. And I was like, and that's when I saw this little picture on the ground. It looked like a photograph of something. I was like, is this what they're talking about? So I pushed A next to it, and it said he picked it up, and then Goku said something. I'm like, oh, this must be what he wants. So I went and handed it to Master Roshi, and then nothing happened, and he said, oh, I'm still looking for my magazines. And I was like, oh, there's more. So I looked around on the island, and then I found another one, and then returned that one back to him, and it was the second one. But and he still said he was missing one of his magazines, and so I was just like, okay, well, what's going on here? I don't see any more. But little did I know is you could actually walk inside Master Roshi's house. I didn't know that. So it took me a little while to figure that part out. I figured out you had to go inside his house, and then I found the last magazine. And then you return it to him. And as soon as you give him all three of his magazines, then Raditz Goku's brother Raditz will show up. And you know how the story goes. Like if you've ever seen the TV show, when Raditz shows up, he basically is talking to Goku, asking him what happened, why are you're supposed to kill everybody on this planet, what's going on. And that's when they discover that Goku had got hit on his head as a kid. And, basically that's what caused him to become a good guy essentially, and because he apparently was very violent as a toddler. But then when he hit his head, when his grandpa Gohan dropped him by accident on his head, dropped him on his head. It's just kind of funny the way you say that. Like you always hear that expression, "Were you dropped on your head?" Well, in Goku's case, it was. Yeah, it's true. Yes, I was, And so anyway, yeah. And essentially the game does a very extremely abridged version of it because like I said, they had to condense some stuff, so they condensed the dialogue quite a bit. So it just kind of rushes through the dialogue of talking about how Goku hit his head and how he became a good guy, and then so Raditz grabs Gohan because he see that Gohan is, still young. And so he grabs him and runs off, with Gohan. And then immediately after that, Piccolo shows up. And at this point in the show, Piccolo is still the bad guy. He's enemies with Goku. And so when he shows up, they're like, oh, go away, Piccolo. We don't want you here. But then Piccolo says that, no, he wants to help Goku defeat Raditz because Raditz is a threat to him as well. And so basically, you and Piccolo are setting off on this mission. So Goku calls out for Nimbus. Nimbus shows up, and basically, as soon as you touch Nimbus, it goes to this screenshot thing. In the first game, they do these weird, essentially like a picture from the show, and they just take a screenshot. And these are like the transitional screens to kind of get you from one part of the game or the one area of the game to the next, and it's showing you kind of what happens. In the second game, they get much more creative. They actually create their own transitional scenes, cut scenes and stuff like that, and it's a lot better and more cinematic and much more fluent. But in this first game, they were still a pretty young. Webfoot Technologies was still a pretty young game at this time. And was a very young company at this time. So when they were creating the Legacy of Goku, they, they were still kind of learning. You can tell with a new style of game like this. But they honestly, in my opinion, they did a really good job for this being like their first adventure RPG style game. And they did really good. So basically, after the transitional screen of Goku being on Nimbus, he immediately appears in front of his house, and Chi-Chi's standing out there. If you don't know who Chi-Chi is, it's Goku's wife, essentially. And so if you talk to Chi-Chi, she asks you where's Gohan at, and he's just like, and she starts getting upset, like, you better bring back our son, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of weird when you're playing the game that he appears in front of his house instead of like out in front of Raditz. I felt like there's kind of a better way they could have done it. I have no idea why they decided to put him in at his front of his house. I feel like they could have just put him in any old generic area, and then you could have slowly traveled your way through the forest or whatever to leading up to Raditz. I totally understand why they didn't just totally just put you right there in front of Raditz, because they wanted you to be able to train up Goku a little bit, and this is your opportunity to like actually play the game as more like an RPG style. And as you work your way up to the village, but I'll talk about that later, there's a lot of adventure elements. Like, it reminds me a lot of like Legacy of Goku and stuff like that. And but I have no idea why they decided to put you in front of Goku's house of all places. It feels a little. That's always felt really bizarre to me. Even when I played the game the very first time, I always felt it was kind of weird that they put you right there in front of Goku's house. I felt like they should have just put you in a general spot, like I said, in the woods or whatever, and then you could have slowly walked up to the, trained your way and walked up to the battle. I felt like that would have been much better. But I guess they were trying to put you in a familiar place, and so that way some of these areas would actually technically be featured in the game, and which I can totally understand. It just, to me, that feels bizarre and out of place. But yeah, that's pretty much the first area. It's Master Roshi's Island, and so in the next episode, like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the next area, which is kind of one whole area. Like I said, I'll explain it. Goku's house is part of it, and then there's like a lake there, and then you slowly work your way like through the woods where all these dinosaurs are and stuff. And then you're in like a village where you help all these people and slowly work your way up to, walking through where Raditz is, and then you go to fight Raditz. But so in the next episode, I'll talk all about these little areas that are connected to each other before you go finally fight against Raditz. So the next episode, there's going to be a lot more stuff to talk about. So this one was mostly just Master Roshi's Island, but I wanted to keep it simple for this episode because I wanted to create time for me to talk about how I got into the series and stuff like that. So anyway, going back to the trivia question. The trivia question was, who was the artist that played Eyes of a Lion? Or what? Eyes of a Lion. Did I say that question right earlier? Yeah, played Eyes of a Lion. So the name of the song was Eyes of a Lion. So who was the artist? I may have stated that question wrong earlier, but the question was, who was the artist that actually played the song Eyes of a Lion? It's featured 3 times in the Legacy of Goku 2. So what was the name of the artist? Do you know what it was? Were you able to remember what it was without actually having to Google it? Maybe. The name of the band was called Silver Spider. Obviously, it's not a real band. It's just made up for the game. But yeah, that's Silver Spider. That's the name of the game. So let me know. You can, if you want to email me or send me a message, there should be in the description, there should be a little message center, and you can let me know on there. Or you can go on my Instagram. The link will be in the description. You can DM me there, DM me on there, or comment or whatever on there, and let me know, what you think about this podcast, if you were able to figure out the trivia question, or if you have a similar story as me, like maybe you were a big fan of the series and then it was a lot of fun for you to actually get to play the stories of these games as Goku, and that was really awesome. And let me know if you still find this game to actually be fun, because me personally, I still like this game. I still find it a lot of fun to play. But like I said, it's definitely not as good as Legacy of Goku 2 and Boo's Fury. That's for sure. I don't think anyone would argue with that. But I still think it's a good game. So let me know what you thought about this podcast. And if, like I said, what you think about this series even as a whole, even today. So that's it for this podcast. I am Kevin Emery. This is the Legacy of Goku podcast, and I'm out.